What happens when a police officer with a power complex pulls over someone who outranks him in every way that matters? The confrontation that unfolded on Interstate 75 would become a case study in abuse of authority, federal jurisdiction, and what occurs when someone accustomed to being the highest authority in the room discovers they're actually at the bottom of the legal food chain. Interstate 75 south of Cincinnati stretched empty in the late evening darkness, the kind of quiet highway where only shift workers and long-distance travelers found themselves after 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The Ohio countryside rolled past in gentle hills and scattered farmhouses, their windows glowing like distant stars against the black horizon. It was peaceful territory, the kind of road where drivers could lose themselves in thought and cover serious ground without the stop-and-go frustration of urban traffic. Judge Samantha Carter had been driving this route for 3 hours, returning from a judicial conference in Columbus, where she'd spent 2 days discussing federal sentencing guidelines and constitutional law updates with fellow appeals court judges. Her government sedan, a modest black Ford that bore no external indication of her status, cut through the darkness with the steady efficiency of a woman accustomed to long days and even longer decisions that affected thousands of lives. At 45, Samantha had spent the last 22 years climbing through the federal judiciary, beginning as a prosecutor fresh out of Harvard Law School and working her way up through district court appointments to her current position on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal. She was one of the youngest federal appeals court judges in the country, confirmed unanimously by the Senate after a career that had earned respect from attorneys across the political spectrum. Her decisions had shaped constitutional law, protected civil rights, and established precedents that would guide legal thinking for generations. But tonight, she was just tired. The conference had been intellectually stimulating but physically draining, filled with dense legal discussions and the kind of careful diplomatic conversations that federal judges navigated when addressing controversial topics. She was looking forward to reaching her Cincinnati home, reviewing tomorrow's case briefs, and getting some sleep before another day of oral arguments and judicial deliberations. Officer Ryan Brooks had been parked in his favorite speed trap location for the better part of 2 hours, tucked behind an overpass where the highway curved slightly, and drivers often exceeded the speed limit without realizing it. At 38, Brooks had 15 years of law enforcement experience, all of it with the Ohio State Highway Patrol, and he'd developed certain habits that had served him well in his own estimation. Brooks believed in authority, specifically, his authority. He'd learned early in his career that the badge and uniform commanded respect, and he'd cultivated an approach to traffic stops that emphasized control and submission. In his experience, drivers who questioned his authority or failed to show appropriate deference were usually hiding something, and he'd built a reputation for aggressive stops that often resulted in additional citations or arrests. Tonight had been slow. A few routine speeders, one drunk driver who'd failed the field sobriety test spectacularly, and several hours of quiet highway patrol that had left Brooks restless and looking for action. When he saw the black sedan approaching at what appeared to be slightly above the posted speed limit, he decided to make a stop. The red and blue lights erupted behind Samantha's sedan without warning. She glanced in her rearview mirror, noted the patrol car, and began the careful process of pulling over safely. Years of judicial security training had taught her the importance of remaining calm during any interaction with law enforcement, even routine traffic stops. She activated her hazard lights, reduced speed gradually, and pulled onto the shoulder in a well-lit area near a highway service station. Brooks approached the driver's side window with his standard demeanor, confident, authoritative, and already convinced that the stop would go according to his script. He'd done this thousands of times, and the routine rarely varied. Most drivers were nervous, apologetic, eager to avoid a ticket. Those who weren't usually provided him with an opportunity to assert additional control, license and registration. Now, Brooks's voice cut through the night air as he reached the window, his flashlight already shining directly into Samantha's face. He hadn't greeted her, hadn't explained the reason for the stop, and his tone suggested he'd already decided she was guilty of something more serious than a minor traffic violation. Samantha squinted against the harsh light, but kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, a practice drilled into her during federal judge security briefings. "Officer, may I ask the reason for this stop?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying the measured tone she used in courtroom proceedings. Brooks immediately bristled at the question. In his experience, drivers who asked questions were usually preparing to argue, lie, or otherwise complicate what should be a simple interaction. "I'll ask the questions here," he replied, his voice growing sharper. "License and registration." Now, Samantha recognized the escalating tone but remained calm. She dealt with far more aggressive attorneys in her courtroom and understood the importance of de-escalation. "Of course, officer. I'm reaching for my purse to retrieve my documents." She moved slowly and deliberately, keeping her hands visible as she reached for her federal judicial identification. When she handed him her documents, Brooks glanced at the license without really reading it, then noticed the federal identification card. "What's this supposed to be?" demanded, his suspicion increasing rather than decreasing. "I'm a federal judge," Samantha explained simply. "I was returning from a judicial conference in Columbus." Brooks's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of the professional courtesy typically extended to judicial officers, his expression hardened. "Federal judge, huh? You think that makes you special?" Samantha was taken aback by his response. "Officer, I simply wanted to identify myself properly." "May I ask what traffic violation prompted this stop?" "You were speeding," Brooks replied, though he hadn't actually clocked her speed and wasn't entirely sure she'd been exceeding the limit. "And now you're being argumentative. Step out of the vehicle." "I beg your pardon." Samantha's judicial training kicked in, and she recognized that the situation was becoming improper. "On what grounds are you asking me to exit the vehicle?" Brooks didn't like being questioned, especially by someone who clearly thought she was better than him. "I'm conducting a sobriety check." Out of the car, Samantha realized she was dealing with an officer who was either poorly trained or deliberately exceeding his authority. "Officer, I haven't been drinking, I've shown no signs of impairment, and I've been completely cooperative. I'd like to understand the legal basis for this request." That was when Brooks lost his temper. "Lady, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. When I give you an order, you follow it. Now get out of the car before I drag you out." Samantha had heard enough. She calmly reached for her phone and activated the recording function. "I want to be clear that I'm documenting this interaction," she said. "I'm Judge Samantha Carter of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I'm requesting that you contact your supervisor immediately." Brooks saw the phone and felt a flash of concern, but his pride was louder than his caution. "Put that phone away and get out of the car, or you're going to jail for obstruction." Samantha stepped out of the vehicle, maintaining her dignity while documenting everything. Brooks proceeded with an unnecessary field sobriety test, making her perform exercises that were clearly intended to humiliate rather than assess impairment. She complied with professional composure, but internally, she was cataloging every violation of proper procedure. When she passed the tests flawlessly, Brooks still wrote her a citation for failure to obey traffic control device, a vague charge that would be difficult to dispute. As he handed her the ticket, he leaned in close and said, "Next time, show some respect for the badge." Samantha took the citation without comment, got back in her car, and drove home. But Brooks had no idea that his routine traffic stop was about to become a federal case. Literally. The next morning, Samantha was in her chambers reviewing the previous night's event. Her law clerk, Michael Chen, noticed her unusually serious demeanor and asked if everything was all right. "Michael, I need you to research something for me," Samantha said. "I want to understand the current federal law regarding civil rights violations by state officials acting under color of authority." Chen raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty specific, Judge. Is this for an upcoming case?" "In a way," Samantha replied. "I need to understand what legal options are available when a police officer violates constitutional rights during a traffic stop." She spent the morning reviewing case law, federal statutes, and constitutional precedents. What she discovered confirmed what she'd suspected. Brooks had violated multiple aspects of proper police procedure and had potentially committed federal civil rights violations. By noon, Samantha had made her decision. She contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division. filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Highway Patrol, and scheduled a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking accountability. The complaint she filed was precise, detailed, and devastating. It included timestamps from her phone recording, citations of relevant federal law, and a point-by-point breakdown of how Brooks had exceeded his authority. Most importantly, it established that his actions weren't just improper, they were potentially criminal. Within 48 hours, the story had reached the FBI's Civil Rights Division in Washington. Within a week, it was on the desk of the Attorney General. A federal judge being unlawfully detained by a state police officer wasn't just a civil rights violation, it was an attack on the federal judiciary itself. Brooks, meanwhile, had returned to his routine, boasting to colleagues about the uppity judge he'd put in her place. He had no idea that his actions were now under federal investigation until his supervisor called him into the office 3 weeks later. "Ryan, we need to talk," Captain Morrison said, closing the office door behind them. "You made a traffic stop 3 weeks ago." "A federal judge." Brooks shrugged. "Yeah. So, she was speeding and gave me attitude. I handled it." Morrison slid a folder across the desk. "The FBI wants to interview you. Internal Affairs is conducting a full investigation, and there's talk of federal charges." For the first time, Brooks felt a flicker of genuine concern. Federal charges? For what? Civil rights violations? Abuse of authority? Possibly deprivation of rights under color of law? Morrison's expression was grim. "Ryan, this woman isn't just any judge. She's on the federal appeals court. Her cases are reviewed by the Supreme Court, and you treated her like a common criminal." Brooks opened the folder and saw his career falling apart in real time. The investigation was comprehensive, professional, and damning. His body camera footage had been reviewed, expert testimony had been gathered, and his past traffic stops were being scrutinized for patterns of abuse. The case went to federal court, with Samantha no longer as just a complainant, but as a witness whose testimony carried the weight of 22 years of judicial experience. When she took the stand, wearing her judicial robes, the contrast between her dignity and Brooks's behavior was stark and undeniable. The federal prosecutor was methodical. "Your Honor, could you describe Officer Brooks's demeanor during the stop?" "He was aggressive from the first moment," Samantha testified. "He made demands without explanation, escalated the situation without cause, and showed no respect for proper procedure or constitutional rights." "Did you feel threatened?" "I felt that Officer Brooks was more interested in asserting dominance than in conducting a lawful traffic stop. His behavior was unprofessional and potentially dangerous." When Brooks took the stand in his defense, he faced cross-examination from federal prosecutors who were experts in dismantling police misconduct cases. His arrogance crumbled under the weight of legal expertise that far exceeded his understanding. "Officer Brooks, are you familiar with the concept of qualified immunity?" "Yes, and you understand that immunity protects officers who act in good faith within the scope of their authority. Would you say that threatening to arrest a federal judge for asking legitimate questions falls within the scope of reasonable police authority?" Brooks hesitated, realizing for the first time that he'd crossed lines he didn't even know existed. The verdict was swift and decisive. Brooks was found guilty of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay damages to Judge Carter. But the real impact went beyond one officer's downfall. The case became a landmark precedent for federal oversight of local police conduct, and Samantha's measured response to abuse of authority became a model for how public officials should handle misconduct while maintaining the dignity of their office. Months later, Samantha was asked to speak at a law enforcement conference about the case. She stood before an audience of police officers, federal agents, and prosecutors, and said simply, "Authority without accountability is just tyranny with a badge. The law applies to everyone, including those sworn to enforce it." Officer Ryan Brooks learned too late that some people you pull over can pull back, with the full weight of federal law behind them. 3 years later, the Brooks Doctrine. The case of Carter Brooks had become more than just one judge's fight for accountability. It had evolved into a watershed moment that fundamentally changed how federal oversight applied to local law enforcement across the United States. The Brooks Doctrine, as legal scholars began calling it, established that federal officials were entitled to heightened protection against state and local police abuse, creating a new category of civil rights enforcement that had far-reaching implications. Judge Samantha Carter found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of a reformer, invited to speak at law schools, police academies, and judicial conferences about the intersection of federal authority and local law enforcement. Her measured response to abuse had become a model for institutional dignity under pressure, studied in constitutional law courses, and cited in dozens of subsequent federal cases involving police misconduct. The FBI had established a dedicated unit for investigating police violations against federal officials, partly in response to the Carter case. Statistics revealed that her experience wasn't isolated. Federal employees, judges, prosecutors, and agents had been facing similar abuse from local officers who either didn't understand federal jurisdiction or chose to ignore it. Brooks himself had served his 18-month sentence and emerged from federal prison a different man. The experience had stripped away his arrogance and forced him to confront the reality that his badge had never given him the unlimited authority he'd assumed. In a surprising turn, he'd become an advocate for police reform, speaking at training seminars about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of constitutional limits. During one of these sessions, a young officer asked him directly, "What would you tell someone who's about to make the same mistake you made?" Brooks paused, remembering that night on Interstate 75, and replied, "I'd tell them that the badge doesn't make you king of the road. Everyone you stop is someone's daughter, someone's father, someone with rights that don't disappear just because you're having a bad day. And some of those people have the power to remind you of that in ways you'll never forget." The Carter case had also led to mandatory federal law training for all state and local police departments receiving federal funding, ensuring that officers understood the limits of their authority when dealing with federal officials. What had begun as one woman's refusal to accept abuse had become a systemic change, protecting thousands of federal employees nationwide. 5 years later, the Samantha Carter Institute, the modest building in downtown Cincinnati, bore no flashy signs or grand architecture, but the Samantha Carter Institute for Judicial Independence had become one of the most influential legal education centers in the country. Established with funding from a coalition of federal judges, civil rights organizations, and surprisingly, police reform advocates, the institute focused on training both law enforcement and legal professionals about the delicate balance between authority and accountability. Judge Carter served on the board reluctantly, preferring her judicial duties to public attention, but she understood the importance of institutional change. The Institute's programs had trained over 15,000 police officers in federal jurisdiction awareness, constitutional limits of authority, and de-escalation techniques specifically designed for interactions with government officials. The center's most popular program was the Constitutional Authority Workshop, where police officers and federal employees participated in role-playing exercises designed to prevent the kind of confrontation that had made Carter's case famous. Officers learned to recognize federal credentials, understand jurisdictional boundaries, and most importantly, treat every traffic stop as an interaction between two professionals serving the public. Brooks had become one of the Institute's most effective instructors, his personal stories serving as a powerful cautionary tale. During training sessions, he would show the body camera footage from that night on Interstate 75, walking participants through each decision point where he could have chosen respect over dominance. "This is where I decided I was more important than the law," he would tell classes, pointing to the moment when Judge Carter first identified herself. "I had 15 years of experience, but I forgot that experience without humility is just arrogance with a badge." The Institute's research division had compiled comprehensive data on police interactions with federal officials, revealing patterns that went far beyond individual bad actors. Their reports showed systemic issues in training, supervision, and accountability that contributed to constitutional violations across multiple jurisdictions. One of their most significant discoveries was that officers who received federal jurisdiction training were 73% less likely to face civil rights complaints and 89% more likely to receive commendations for professional conduct. The data proved that education, not punishment, was the most effective tool for preventing abuse. Judge Carter often reflected on how a routine drive home had evolved into a national movement for police accountability. Her chambers now displayed letters from federal employees who had avoided similar confrontations because officers recognized their credentials and treated them with appropriate respect. The Institute had also established the Brooks Fellowship, a program that helped former officers who had lost their careers due to misconduct find paths toward redemption through community service and reform advocacy. It was named, ironically, for the man whose abuse had started everything, but who had become living proof that people could change when forced to confront their mistakes. During the Institute's 5th anniversary celebration, Judge Carter addressed an audience of police chiefs, federal officials, and reform advocates. "Authority is not a privilege," she said. "It's a responsibility that we hold in trust for the people we serve. When we forget that trust, we don't just harm individuals, we damage the institutions that protect all of us." She paused, looking out at the crowd that included Brooks, now working as a civilian instructor, and several officers whose careers had been transformed by the Institute's training. The goal was never to punish police officers or elevate federal officials above the law. The goal was to ensure that everyone, regardless of their position, is treated with the dignity and respect that the Constitution guarantees. That night on Interstate 75, I wasn't just defending my own rights, I was defending the principle that no badge, no matter how shiny, gives anyone the right to ignore the law they swore to uphold. Brooks nodded from the audience, understanding better than anyone the truth of her words. His journey from abuser to advocate had been painful, but it had also been necessary. The Institute continued to grow, training thousands more officers and preventing countless constitutional violations through education rather than litigation. The woman who had simply wanted to drive home from a conference had become the catalyst for one of the most significant police reform movements in decades, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger, it's accountability.